Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a power source that's always on, always stable, just a few feet beneath your garden or even your living room floor. It's not some exotic new fuel, it's just the Earth. Down there, the temperature stays remarkably consistent year-round.
That's really the core idea behind geothermal heating and cooling. It's leveraging that incredibly stable thermal mass of the ground
Right.
to efficiently regulate temperatures above ground. It sounds almost too simple, maybe, but the implications are huge for heating, cooling, and even things like, extending growing seasons.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today. We've pulled together a real stack of resources, insights from industry pros and articles like one from Contracting Business, deep dives into sustainable ag practices from folks like ATTRA.
Right, ATTRA's got some great stuff.
Yeah, plus practical experiences shared by people on sites like Reddit and Intelligent Living and data from the EIA as well.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to cut through all that info and give you the essential knowledge. We want you to walk away understanding what these systems are, how they tap into the Earth's energy.
How they actually work.
Exactly. The different ways they can be installed, what's truly involved in, like having and maintaining one, the real costs and savings.
And crucially, how they're being used in practical ways, especially for things like greenhouses, which is fascinating.
Definitely.
Consider this your shortcut to getting well-informed on this cool, Earth-powered tech. So let's get right into it. When we talk about geothermal heating and cooling, what's the fundamental concept at play?
Okay, so it all starts with recognizing that unlike the air temperature, which swings wildly, hot summer days, freezing winter nights,
Right, all over the place.
the temperature of the Earth's subsurface stays incredibly stable. Just a few feet down, usually starting around 2 feet or so, that temperature steadies out. It averages around 55 degrees hour across most of the U.S.
55 degrees year-round.
Pretty much, yeah. Regardless of whether it's scorching hot or freezing outside.
That stability is key then. So how does a system actually use that?
Well, it works by circulating a medium. This could be either a liquid or just air through a system of pipes buried underground.
Okay.
In the winter, when your building is cold, that cooler medium goes down into the earth, which, remember, is around 55 degrees, so it's warmer than the outside air. The earth transfers heat to the medium.
Warming it up.
Exactly. That now warmer medium returns to your building for heating. In the summer, it's the reverse. Your building is hot, the warmer medium goes into the earth, which is cooler than the air.
Still 55 degrees.
Right. The earth absorbs heat from the medium, and the now cooler medium returns for cooling.
Okay. So it's not creating heat or cold like a furnace burning fuel or an air conditioner using refrigerant to, force coldness.
Right.
It's literally just moving heat, taking it from the building to the earth in summer and from the earth to the building in winter.
Precisely. That's why they're often called heat exchangers or ground source heat pumps. And because the Earth's temperature is so moderate and constant,
Right.
the system doesn't have to work nearly as hard as, say, an air source heat pump that's fighting against maybe 0-degree air or 90-degree air outside.
And I guess that difference in how hard it has to work translates directly into efficiency, right?
Yeah.
I've seen some numbers that are almost hard to believe compared to traditional systems.
Oh, they're dramatically more efficient. Standard geothermal systems are rated with a coefficient of performance, or COP, ranging from 300% to 600%.
300 to 600%.
Yeah, think of that as getting 3 to 6 units of heat output for every 1 unit of electrical energy you use to run the system.
Wow.
The sources point out this is at least twice as efficient as the most efficient air conditioners and still almost 50% more efficient than even the best gas furnaces. And that efficiency holds up all year long.
That's genuinely impressive. Okay, so the core idea is using the Earth's stable temperature to move heat. But the sources describe different approaches, different types of systems. What are the main categories?
Yeah, the fundamental split is between active and passive systems. Active systems are the ones you most commonly see for, like home heating and cooling.
Okay.
They use a heat pump, which is a key component, and a liquid, usually water, or water mixed with glycol antifreeze as the heat exchange medium.
Right, the antifreeze for colder climates.
Exactly. This liquid circulates through buried pipes in what's called a ground loop, and the heat pump facilitates the transfer using a refrigeration cycle. It's similar in principle to a regular heat pump or AC, but it's connected to the ground instead of the outside air.
And within those active systems, I read there are different ways the pipes, the ground loops, are laid out.
That's right. You've got horizontal loops, which involve digging trenches, usually a few feet deep. This needs more land area.
Takes up more yard space.
Yeah, but the excavation part is generally less expensive. Or you have vertical loops. For those, they drill boreholes deep into the earth, often hundreds of feet down.
Wow.
This uses much less surface area, which is great for smaller lots, but the drilling itself is more complex and definitely more costly.
Makes sense. And what about the liquid source? Is it always the same fluid circulating?
Good question. Active systems can be either closed loop or open loop. Closed loop is the most common. It's a sealed system where the same water antifreeze mix just circulates constantly.
Okay.
Open loop systems actually use a body of water like a well or maybe a pond or lake if you have one suitable. Water is drawn from one point, say one well, run through the heat exchanger.
Inside the heat pump?
Right, and then it's returned to the source at a different point, like a second well or back into the pond.
Yeah.
However, the sources we looked at, like Reddit discussions, note that open-loop systems are less commonly installed these days. There can be regulatory hurdles or just site suitability issues.
Okay, that covers the active side. Heat pump, liquids, different pipe layouts, open versus closed loop. What about the passive systems? How are they different?
Passive systems are much simpler in concept and often lower tech. They're sometimes called earth batteries or
Yeah.
climate batteries or low-grade geothermal. Big difference. They use air as the heat exchange medium, not liquid.
Air. Okay.
And crucially, they don't use a heat pump. Their main job is really to store excess heat from a space like a greenhouse on a sunny day into the Earth's thermal mass, or to pull that stored heat back up when needed. They primarily just rely on fans to blow air through underground piping.
So is that the same thing as what some people call GAHT, ground air heat transfer?
Yes, exactly. That's the specific term for these systems that use air. Traditional active geothermal uses liquid. The Reddit discussion we saw points out that while they're technically distinct,
People use the terms loosely sometimes?
yeah, people often just say geothermal more broadly to include these GHT passive systems because fundamentally they both involve exchanging heat with the earth.
Got it.
Okay.
Active liquid heat pump. Passive dot. Air. Fans. Both using that stable earth temperature. Now, beyond just typical home or commercial building climate control, where are these systems showing real promise?
Well, a particularly compelling application, and one highlighted really well by the ATTRA research, is in agriculture, specifically for climate control in greenhouses and high tunnels.
Ah.
This is where passive systems in particular seem to really shine, especially for smaller scale operations.
That makes so much sense. If you want to extend your growing season or grow things you couldn't normally, having stable, low-energy heating or cooling would be a huge advantage.
Absolutely. Renewable geothermal energy is pretty ideal for modifying the climate inside these structures. It lets growers get an earlier start in the spring, harvest later into the fall, or even grow more sensitive crops right through challenging parts of the year.
So how do you decide which type of system, active or passive, is right for, say, a greenhouse versus a house?
Scale and the structure type itself are really critical factors. The ATTRI source explains that passive systems are often the most practical and cost-effective choice for smaller-scale agriculture,
Oh.
especially when you pair them with structures that are already designed for energy efficiency, like insulated high tunnels or passive solar greenhouses. They just work best with a smaller volume of air to heat or cool.
Right.
An active system, with its higher energy output from the heat pump might actually be overkill or just too expensive to install for a simple, maybe less insulated high tunnel. Active systems are generally better suited for more substantial, well-built structures or, large commercial facilities.
So it sounds like before you even think about digging trenches or drilling wells, you really have to look at the building itself.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial before you build point that ATTRI stresses heavily. Installing any geothermal system, active or passive, on a leaky, poorly insulated greenhouse is just, well, it's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it.
Wasting energy and money.
Exactly. You must ensure the structure is well sealed and insulated first. Things like sealing up gaps around doors and vents, using double-layered plastic walls with inflation blowers between them, maybe insulated end walls. These are essential energy conservation steps to take before you invest in the geothermal part.
Insulate and seal first, then think about adding the geothermal tech.
Ugh.
Makes sense. What else is important in that planning phase?
Site assessment is vital. You really need to understand your local conditions. What's your hardiness zone? What are the typical temperature swings, high and low? What are the specific temperature needs of the crops you plan to grow?
And the ground itself.
Yeah, your soil type, its composition, how well it drains, that's key. How much land do you actually have available for loops? And the hydrology of your site is important too. You want to avoid areas with a very high water table or maybe impermeable layers like rock or hard clay close to the surface, because that could hinder the Earth's ability to exchange heat effectively.
Okay, planning and site assessment are done. Let's talk about the actual design and installation. Maybe let's focus a bit on those passive systems since they seem particularly interesting for small-scale growers.
Sure. So even for passive systems, careful planning is absolutely non-negotiable. Mistakes underground are incredibly difficult and expensive to fix later.
Right, you don't want to have to dig it all up again.
Definitely not. Key design factors highlighted by sources like Ceres Greenhouse Solutions mentioned in the ATTRA doc include properly sizing the fan, choosing the right diameter and length of pipe, ensuring all the connections underground are perfectly sealed, designing for proper drainage, which is especially important with these air systems.
Why drainage? You mentioned that before.
Right, well, for passive systems blowing air through the pipes, you get condensation. It's from the evaporative cooling process, so the piping needs to be perforated, have small holes in it to allow that moisture to drain out into the surrounding soil. If it can't drain, the pipes can eventually plug up with water or even sediment, and then the system just won't work right.
Okay, perforated pipes for drainage. Makes sense.
Yeah.
And how do you figure out the right size fan and how much pipe you actually need?
The sizing is generally based on the volume of air inside your structure, your greenhouse or high tunnel. The goal for optimal efficiency seems to be around 5 air turnovers per hour.
5 turnovers per hour.
Yeah. So you calculate the necessary fan capacity in CFM, that's cubic feet per minute, by taking the total volume of your structure in cubic feet and dividing it by the desired exchange rate in minutes. So for 5 turnovers an hour, that's 60 minutes divided by 5 turnovers, which is 12 minutes. So volume divided by 12 gives you your target CFM for the fan.
Okay, volume divided by 12 for the fan size. What about the pipe layout underground? How does that work for passive systems?
For passive systems, a common layout involves running 2 layers of that perforated piping horizontally along the length of the structure. The ADTRA source suggests placing them at different depths, maybe one layer around 2 feet deep and another around 4 feet deep.
2 layers.
Yeah. And crucially, you need adequate spacing between the pipes. ATRA recommends at least 2 feet between each row and also between the different levels of piping.
Why so much space?
That space is needed for the soil itself to effectively absorb or release heat. You need that thermal mass of soil around each pipe to do its job. It's essentially charging the earth battery. If the pipes are too close, they interfere with each other's heat exchange.
Okay, 2 feet apart. And if you're retrofitting an existing greenhouse?
For retrofits, they mention you might bury the pipes just outside next to the north or south wall, but you still need the same total linear footage of pipe, and you still absolutely need to maintain that proper spacing.
And when do you actually run these passive systems? Is it just on all the time or whenever you need heat or cooling?
It's usually more strategic than that. You typically run a passive system when there's, say, excess heat in the greenhouse you want to store underground, like on a sunny winter day when it gets too warm inside.
Push the heat down.
Exactly. Or you run it when the structure temperature is lower than the subsoil temperature, and you want to draw that stored warmth back up. This is often managed with a 2-stage thermostat, or maybe a more integrated control system.
Okay.
The forces also advise, interestingly, against running the system continuously during extended periods of extreme cold.
Wait, why would you turn it off in extreme cold? Doesn't that seem backwards?
It does seem counterintuitive at first, but the reason is to protect your earth battery. If you keep pulling heat out of the ground nonstop during prolonged, really deep freezes, you can actually deplete the stored thermal energy in that soil volume. You could pull the temperature down well below that stable 55-degree Celsius range.
You can overdraw the battery.
Exactly. So in those extreme situations, it might actually be more efficient overall to rely on a backup heating method temporarily, just to let the earth battery recover its temperature.
Is this kind of installation, especially the passive type, something a handy person with access to some equipment could potentially tackle themselves? A DIY project?
Well, the ATTR source does mention the potential for DIY installation for the simpler passive systems, particularly if you have access to something like a backhoe and have some construction or earth-moving experience. They even cite Russ Finch.
Greenhouse and the Snow Guy.
Yeah, who reportedly did his system largely without heavy excavators, mostly just with hand labor, which is pretty amazing. A Reddit user also noted that doing your own trenching could definitely save money, although you still need to account for the labor and materials for the loops themselves.
But there've got to be some real safety considerations here.
Right.
Digging deep trenches.
Oh, absolutely. Huge ones. The Reddit discussion includes a strong cautionary note about the significant risks of DIY excavation, particularly trench collapse. That can be fatal.
Yeah, that's serious.
It is. And because of that liability, commercial geothermal companies often won't allow homeowners to do the digging part themselves. So while DIY is potentially possible for simple setups on your own property, it really requires a strong understanding of your site conditions, using proper safety protocols, and maybe even getting some professional guidance to ensure it's done safely and correctly. As one Reddit user put it, it requires really knowing your property and having the structure oriented properly in the first place.
Okay, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Cost. Geothermal is often seen as having a pretty high upfront price tag. What do the sources say about the actual costs and, maybe more importantly, the eventual payoff?
Yeah, there's no getting around the fact that the initial investment can be significant. The ATTRA source gives a really broad range, from maybe $1,200 for a very simple passive system if you do a lot of the labor yourself, maybe up to $25,000 or even more for more sophisticated systems. It depends heavily on the complexity and whether you have access to excavation equipment or have to hire it out.
And that excavation piece sounds like it's a huge chunk of the cost.
It is often the largest single component, especially for active systems. The ATTR source explicitly states that renting or hiring excavation equipment is typically the majority of the installation cost.
Oh, wow.
And the real-world numbers shared on Reddit seem to back this up. One user quoted $2,000 per vertical well for residential systems. So, for a standard 4-ton system needing maybe 4 wells, you're looking at $8,000 just for the drilling.
Before you even buy the heat pump unit.
Exactly, before factoring in the unit itself or the rest of the installation. Other drilling quotes mentioned were in the $15,000 to $19,500 range just for vertical loops.
Okay, so vertical drilling is clearly expensive.
Mm-hmm.
What about that passive system example cost you mentioned earlier, the small high tunnel one?
Right. ATTRA provided a cost breakdown for Dave McCarson's specific 10 by 20 by 8 foot high tunnel passive system. That included materials like fans, piping, fittings, and even an estimate for hired excavation. That total came in around $1,747.
Okay, much lower.
Yeah, it demonstrates that passive systems, particularly for smaller structures, can be much more affordable on the upfront side.
And for larger residential systems, the full active systems, what kind of total costs were people seeing? Ballpark.
The Reddit users shared residential quotes ranging anywhere from around $20,000 up to $53,000 before any incentives or tax credits.
Okay, before incentives, that's a key point.
Yeah.
Tell me about those incentives. How much do they help?
They help a lot. Federal, state, and sometimes even local utility tax credits and rebates are widely available for geothermal, and they can dramatically reduce that initial sticker shock.
Yeah.
The Intelligent Living source gives a great example. They called them the Johnson family. Their system initially cost $25,000. But after a $6,500 federal tax credit and $3,000 in state or local incentives, their actual out-of-pocket expense dropped to $15,500.
That's a huge difference, nearly $10,000 off. So how quickly do you recoup that $15,500 investment then?
Well, that depends heavily on the system size, the final installation cost after incentives, and crucially, what fuel source you're replacing. But the operating costs for geothermal are remarkably low. You're primarily just using electricity to run the heat pump or fans, not actually generating heat by burning fuel.
Right.
The Johnson family example, again, is really telling. Their annual energy bill apparently dropped from $1,800 when they were using fossil fuels down to just $300 with geothermal.
Wow. $1,500 a year in savings.
Exactly, an annual saving of $1,500. So at that rate, they projected breaking even on their $15,500 net investment in just over 10 years. And over the system's expected 25-year lifespan, they estimated a net positive saving of around $22,000.
So the long-term savings combined with those significant incentives make the payback actually quite attractive, even with a higher upfront cost.
It seems so, yes.
Okay, once the system is installed and running, what does it take to keep it running smoothly? Is there a lot of complex maintenance involved?
Generally speaking, compared to, say, fossil fuel furnaces or even standard air conditioners, maintenance is usually lower. But the contracting business article really emphasizes the importance of getting annual service done by a trained technician.
An annual checkup.
Yeah, to ensure you keep getting those efficiency benefits, the savings, and just ensure the system lasts as long as it should. They highlight that professional service helps verify the system is performing exactly as designed, which translates directly into consistent comfort and keeping those utility bills low.
What are the key things a technician is actually checking during one of those service visits?
Well, a good service check, according to that article by Sonny Hampton, who sounds like he has a ton of experience.
Yeah, 40 years or something.
Something like that. He says they should be verifying things like the water or fluid flow rate in the ground loop, checking pressure differences,
Okay.
checking the temperature difference of the fluid going in versus coming out, and comparing that to the manufacturer's specs to make sure the heat exchange with the ground is happening correctly.
Making sure it's pulling enough heat out or putting enough heat in.
Exactly. They'll also check the air side, measuring the air temperature change across the indoor coil to make sure the heating or cooling is effectively being delivered into the building's ductwork. And then there's the more standard stuff, inspecting and cleaning components like the indoor coil and, of course, the air filter, making sure airflow isn't restricted. If the system has a desuperheater, that's a little component that can help heat domestic hot water.
Oh, right. Some systems do that.
Yeah, they'll check its function too, because proper operation there saves you money on your hot water heating costs. And finally, they'll check and often repressurize the ground loop in closed systems, making sure there's adequate fluid pressure and purging out any air or debris that might have gotten trapped in the loop.
So it sounds like a mix of checking performance numbers against the specs and then cleaning and verifying the basic mechanical components. Are there things a homeowner can or should do between those professional visits?
Absolutely. Intelligent Living has some good recommendations there. Things like regularly changing or cleaning your air filters maybe every 3 months or so, depending on your system. Just checking your thermostat settings periodically. Keeping the landscape clear around where the outdoor loops are buried. You know where that is. And just doing a visual inspection of the indoor unit for any obvious issues like leaks.
And basic troubleshooting. What if the system just isn't heating or cooling right one day?
Well, the basic advice is pretty similar to other HVAC systems. First, check your thermostat, make sure it's set correctly and has power. Then, check your air filter, make sure it's clean and not blocked.
The simple stuff first.
Always. If the problem persists, especially if you notice unusual noises coming from the unit, or see any leaks, or notice a loss in water pressure on the loop gauges if you have them, that's when you call a qualified technician right away. They have the specialized tools and knowledge to diagnose issues with the refrigerant system or the ground loop itself.
Okay. It sounds like proactive maintenance, both the DIY filter changes and the annual professional checkup, is really key to maximizing those long-term benefits and savings.
Definitely seems that way.
Beyond the economics and the efficiency, which are already pretty compelling, what's the environmental upside of geothermal? Why is it seen as such a green technology?
This is arguably one of the strongest arguments for geothermal, because these systems don't burn fossil fuels on site.
No combustion.
Right, no combustion. They dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with heating and cooling. Intelligent Living estimates up to a 50% reduction in CO2 emissions for home heating and cooling compared to systems that rely on burning fossil fuels.
50% reduction, that's significant.
It really is. And the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, also provides some compelling data on the power plant side. They state that geothermal power plants emit significantly less pollution than fossil fuel plants, something like 97% less acid rain-causing sulfur compounds, and roughly 99% less CO2 for similarly sized operations.
Wow, 99% less CO2. And the energy source itself, the heat from the earth, is renewable, right?
Exactly. The heat within the earth is, for all practical purposes, a constantly replenished resource. The EIA points out that many geothermal power plants actually enhance this renewability by injecting the used steam and water back down into the earth, which helps sustain those underground reservoirs.
What about water usage? That's becoming a bigger and bigger concern in many places.
That's another environmental plus. Geothermal heat pumps, especially the closed-loop systems, which are most common for homes, use significantly less water than conventional power plants, which often require absolutely vast amounts of water for cooling towers.
So better for drought-prone regions.
Definitely. It makes geothermal a particularly appealing option in areas facing water scarcity.
And a smaller physical footprint on the land, too, I suppose.
Yes, generally the environmental footprint is quite low. Most of the system, the ground loop, is buried underground, out of sight, so it minimizes land disruption above ground and helps protect natural habitats compared to, say, large power plants or fuel extraction sites.
It's really compelling to see how this technology seems to benefit both the wallet over the long term and the planet. To make it even more concrete, let's quickly touch on those case studies from the ATTRA source. The growers who are actually using this, particularly the passive systems in some pretty challenging climates.
Yeah, they highlighted a couple of interesting ones. First, there's Dave McCarson from Alpine Organic Farms in Montana. He specializes in passive solar greenhouses combined with horizontal passive geothermal, what he calls climate batteries.
Montana. That's got to be cold, zones 3 and 4.
Yeah, exactly. See some serious cold. He found these passive systems were effective for his smaller structures, like a 10 by 20 foot high tunnel he used as an example. And a key factor for him was that the installation was relatively cheap because he already had the excavation equipment and the know-how.
The DIY potential again.
Right. But his big takeaway, especially for high tunnels, was that having double-layered, inflated, insulated walls was absolutely essential to make the geothermal system cost-effective. You have to stop the heat loss first before the geothermal can really do its job efficiently.
Insulate first, then geothermal. Got it. And then there's Russ Finch, the greenhouse and the snow guy in Nebraska, growing citrus in Nebraska. That sounds almost unbelievable, especially in zones 45 with winter lows down to negative 27 degrees Fahrenheit.
It really does sound incredible. Finch designs passive solar greenhouses, and he uses an open-loop passive geothermal system. His success relies on tapping into that stable soil temperature he accesses at about 8 feet deep.
8 feet down.
Yeah. He's managed to create what sounds like an impressively simple system that, in his view, is installable with just a backhoe and basic labor. For his standard 96-foot greenhouses, he uses a kind of rule of thumb. 1 underground air tube per 6 feet of greenhouse length, so about 16 tubes total. He freely admits that his sizing came more from trial and error than precise engineering calculations, noting that passive systems can be tricky to model perfectly. But the proof is in the pudding. He consistently gets a 35 to 40 degree of temperature difference between the air entering his ground loops and the air exiting them.
Wow, a 35-40 degree swing just from moving air through the earth passively. That's powerful.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned he doesn't think his specific simple system would work well for typical big hoop houses or larger traditional greenhouses.
That's right. He believes those structures just have too large an air volume for his simpler passive approach to effectively condition the air. It really circles back to that crucial point we keep hearing. You have to match the system type and size very carefully to the specific structure's efficiency and its air volume.
Okay, so we've really taken a deep dive here into the earth beneath our feet, haven't we?
We have.
We've seen how geothermal systems, and maybe particularly the passive ones for applications like greenhouses, offer a genuinely sustainable path towards climate control. We've explored the underlying science, that constant earth temperature.
Right, the foundation of it all.
The practical steps from planning and site assessment through installation and maintenance. We've weighed the upfront costs against those significant long-term savings and the available incentives.
Which can make a huge difference.
Definitely. And we've looked at the really compelling environmental benefits. Lower emissions, renewable resource, less water usage.
Yeah, whether you're someone just thinking about heating your home more efficiently, or maybe you're a grower aiming to defy the seasonal limits in your garden or farm, or honestly, even if you're just someone who appreciates elegant technological solutions that are rooted in natural principles.
Like using the earth itself.
Exactly. Tapping into the Earth's constant temperature is a really powerful concept.
And it really leaves you with a final question, doesn't it? Given that incredibly consistent temperature source just sitting there a few feet down, available almost anywhere, and the increasing global need for efficient, sustainable ways to control climate, for our comfort, yes, but also for our food production, maybe even for our future, could geothermal systems quietly become the widespread unseen foundation of how we heat and cool everything from our homes to our greenhouses in the years to come? What untapped potential is waiting right there beneath your feet?
It's definitely something worth considering. A lot of potential there.